As you see, the title on the board is a bit different from the title we have in the program, but it is probably easier to understand, and also it has an illustration which explains a lot. I will first go through the vocabulary and then tell you what I plan to do or what is going on in the paper, and then present the paper as far as I get in 15 minutes. Now, it says from integration through law to the delegalization of Europe. That is the story, the narrative about Europe. Integration through law is well known. My point here is that the present crisis of law in Europe is not just coming out of the blue, but that there is a construction in Europe, a tension between what Europe is trying to accomplish and the means it has available that was bound to produce problems, and the present ironic, if you want, or tragic, more tragic. There are not bad guys at work. What is so tragic about it is that we now have a situation where the law is destructed, and I will explain this, what I mean by that. Now, I have, of course, also a methodology, and you see it says an exercise in sociological jurisprudence. What is specific about sociological jurisprudence? Very easy. We all do that. We all, when we start to produce a doctrine or to produce a legal theory, we have in the background something about reality. This is what the sociological side of the legal process is. Sociological jurisprudence, a school of thought, which this gentleman here represents very well. He could explain that. The other side is economic sociology, and there you see this picture of Karl Polanyi, who is, of course, the hero, founding father, and I must say I'm studying since a decade only, and it is still fascinating to see how powerful a couple of things he did are, although I have learned yesterday about his problems getting a stipend and so on. We can all be right. Now, how is the paper constructed? I will first, and this is, I think, a message which is very well placed in this circle here. Integration through law was the trademark of the European project for a long time, and I say what we now experience is the disintegration of Europe and the deconstruction of law. Delegalization, I call that. I will tell this as a thesis and then try to explain why this has some background in the present jurisprudence. Here my villain and hero is, of course, the European Court of Justice with his 3 decisions in Pringle, Gauweiler, and now we have the third one, Weiss. Weiss, because somebody among the plaintiffs is called Weiss. Okay, these 3. And then I will turn to the, well, what can we do? This is the third part of the paper. How do we get out of this? And then I will start with Habermas versus Streeck. Habermas, more Europe, Streeck, more nation state. And then I will introduce Polanyi again, and Polanyi says neither nor. And this is, I think, my interpretation of his concluding chapter, but we are all free in the interpretations we do. And then I will say why this Polanyi vision of cooperation fits so well into the Joerges conflicts law. All this in 15 minutes is a bit too much. I will see how far I get. I think if I get through the first part, I'm fine. The term at the core of my kind of European law is untranslatable. Wirtschaftsrecht. Wirtschaftsrecht is something, as my Italian colleagues at the Institute explained me, doesn't exist. It doesn't exist. We have administrative law and we have private law. What do you want here? I said, I have a chair for that. Thanks to... Okay, this is only to indicate that indeed there is something in this notion which does not fit. And I think the tradition of Wirtschaftsrecht, as it has been invented in 19th century Germany, has this idea that the Wirtschaft needs law and needs to be ordered, ordering of economy and society through law. And this is, of course, a project we have yesterday talked briefly about Hermann Heller. He would fit into this picture, although he didn't write on Wirtschaftsrecht, but he had an idea about what a legitimate democratic society should organize. Now, this is Wirtschaftsrecht, and the Polanyi touched and that I want to introduce is, I think, very important and enriching, because what is so specific about Polanyi's understanding of the economic, you all know, and he dislikes it deeply, has written an article on it, but well, everybody is free to like or dislike, but the term embeddedness is indeed very problematic. And there are people who said, Polanyi has used it occasionally, but this is not really the point. The embeddedness people who come later have this kind of cozy idea that we turn back into some holy age in the past, and this is impossible. Now, what I think he is really helpful for is to understand why there is a political dimension in the economic. And this he does with his movements and counter-movements and his basic message. And this is now where I think he is also important for European law, to say markets are never self-regulating entities. If you think you have that, then you present a stark utopia, which is false. And what you do is you expose society to destructive influences if you exaggerate it. He is not denying that markets are helpful institutions. What he's saying, if you expose certain societal accomplishments, say the organization of labor, money, and land is environment, if you there go ahead with marketization processes, you will destruct important preconditions of societal survival, and you will also, if you are, well, there are different counter moves. You can produce fascism, which is what he was confronted with, good Polanyi, and this is what his book is about. The great transformation is not to turn to a socialist future. The great transformation is the transformation of a liberal economic order into fascism. This is a great transformation. And only the concluding chapter has, now what is so specific about the political, what he says, and what is moving this ahead? There is a little, he has not written much after the Great Transformation, but one article I think is particularly interesting, and this he called the economy as instituted process. This is a terrible word, you don't find it in Google, or maybe you find it, but it is difficult to explain. But he had the idea that when we talk about the economy, we always operate on two levels. One level is the formalist, what you call formalist, and this is the organization of exchange. This is really the liberal economy. And the other side of it is the substantive side. The economy is often there to help us to accomplish what we want, the needs we have. So the substantive of the economy and the formal side of the economy are in a constant tension. And this I find, if you would read, that's a difficult article, but I think it is insightful in that when you look at what is around us, that you encounter the political dimension of the economy. Now, I don't go into that at this point any further, but I would like now to turn to my story about Europe. From Rome to Maastricht, we can call it, or from Rome, well, where to? To Copenhagen. No. It's interesting how these places where contracts or the treaty revisions are done become so important, and we do not yet know where the next one will be. It's in the air and it is necessary, but we don't see it happening. Now, integration through law. Integration through law. I mean, there's unlimited admiration for Joseph Weiler in this room and elsewhere around the world. And nevertheless, I think integration through law, as it has been spelled out by himself and Renaud de Hoos in one classical, if you want, but poor summary, is actually a very strange theory. Integration through law, why is it so strange? It assumes that the legal diversity in Europe is a bad thing. Why is it bad? Very difficult to answer. It is bad because it is an obstacle to market integration or the exchange of goods. So it's a bad thing, but it may be a good thing, as we know. And then the second dimension, what I find really irritating, is this idea that the law is both the object and the agent of integration. This article to which I refer has been published in 92 or 91, Now, this was a time where the critical legal studies movement was already going downhill, right? And still it was clear that sociological thinking is enriching the law. Law in Context was a program of the University Institute in Florence. And what is law in context? When you learn that law is the driver, the object and the agent of integration. If you unify law, you have Europe. That is the idea. Now, what is more politically interesting is that this integration through law trademark did not respect what the real trademark of post-war Europe was. And this, I would say, can be taken from Milward. The European rescue of the welfare state. This is his message. All the states after the great transformation, the post-transformation states, turned to Keynesianism and to welfare state arrangements, with the leading country, the UK. The UK took the lead, and what Milward shows beautifully is that this was a consensus in Europe, and nobody expected that Europe would destroy this. This was the common European agenda, and one thought, and one had reason to believe, that this kind of welfareism can be there can be diversity, and there can nevertheless be a common market. And this is the famous theory of Ruggie and his embedded liberalism. Okay. Now, you all know that Europe turned into creating Europe through marketization, through perfectioning market, and to going step by step to ever more uniformity in terms of economic, in the legal environment of the economy as a market economy needs it. If you think of Polanyi, you can predict this must go wrong. This must go wrong if Polanyi has a point. And indeed, you saw what Polanyi characterized as counter movements. I have still 5 minutes. This is eternity. Now, what Polanyi said, this will produce counter movement, and you can look at it. You can look and see how, under the pressure simply of expectation, but also in order to respond to the political dimension of the economy, Europe produced a great regulatory arrangements. First, Mayone developed a theory of the regulatory state, and so on, and then came to turn to governance. Now, this is indicating, say, two Americans, Caporaso and Taro, in an article in international organizations, this is a Polanyian dimension of Europe. I don't believe that, because the Polanyian counter movement is always a social movement also, and this was not at the highlight. What this doesn't capture is indeed the progress of, I have still 3 minutes and I have to stop it here. With the counter movement, this is not the right counter movement. The real problem with the European thing is that the quest for social justice, the quest for the defense of welfare states, the survival of welfare state was neglected. And this happened dramatically in the in emergency Europe, in the crisis times. I now take still a couple of sentences because I have to explain why I'm so excited about crisis law. There is a tendency among my colleagues, hopefully not Matthias, but I don't know. You never know. But the point is that we have produced admirably, if you want to. I mean, the union method has produced an enormous body of law, and this kind of body of law has not an aesthetic beauty, but it is an amazingly elaborate contract. Now, the problem is that this kind of law has produced a kind of political regime which is absolutely undemocratic, and I say even destructing the rule of law. And this is, so to speak, a counter-narrative against this fantasy of we experience the auto-liberalization of Europe. Nothing is auto-liberal about this, nothing. And maybe we have time in the discussion to go in there. My three examples of the three judicial decisions are Pringle, Gauweiler, and Weisnau. In all of these are measures of the European Central Bank rescuing the euro at a price, and the price is democracy and the rule of law. Now, the greatest document in that sense is not the court itself, but the opinion of the Advocate General. Cruz is the second name, this I know, and the first name, Cruz Villalon, or however you pronounce him. And what he has done is to say the turn to monetary policy implies, or the importance of monetary policy implies, that the bank must have a great sphere of discretion, and that courts have no legitimacy to interfere with that, and the ECB must accordingly be afforded a broad discretion to implement the kind of policies I want. And then, oh, there's still 2 minutes, that's very grateful. I will take you into one, at least a citation from, I hope I find him immediately. No, this is Polanyi. But okay, what is happening with the European Central Bank? The European Central Bank, as an emergency measure, and for reasons I can understand in functional terms, has indeed used monetary policy, outright monetary transaction, and even more so quantitative easing, to establish a transfer union in Europe. And a transfer union established, or a fiscal union established through a central bank in its autonomy, is quite a coup d'etat. This is something you can say it has to be done, it's emergency. And I would say so, but even if it's emergency, even Carl Schmitt would have said, well, but it cannot be permanent. And what we experience indeed today, I think we realize it will not be permanent. The rescue of the euro is now again a very problematic accomplishment. Our friends in Italy will tell us how long this can survive. The next crisis, in my view, at the horizon. Now, what does this all mean for our discipline? This is explained in the second part of the paper, where I go to Habermas and Streeck, and then again to Polanyi. And in order to conclude it, I cite this wonderful message he has in the last chapter. And it is, I think, a prophetic kind of language. With the disappearance of the automatic mechanism of the gold standard, governments will find it possible to tolerate willingly how other nations shape their domestic institutions according to their inclination, thus transcending the pernicious 19th century dogma of the necessary uniformity of domestic regimes within the orbit of the world economy. On the ruins of the old world, cornerstones of the new can be seen to emerge: economic collaboration of governments and this liberty to organize national life at will. So, diversity in the organization of economy and society, not under the pressure of uniformity, not in isolation, but there is a need to cooperation. And this need to cooperation, I think, is an insight where we can say this is probably not necessarily the kind of exercise we are doing by imposing uniformity on countries. It is unproductive what we are doing, but my prediction is Polanyi is not yet dead, and this need to replace the kind of political prevailing orientation towards imposed convergence will have to be replaced by more flexible, more learning arrangements, and cooperation is the third way out of that. I have to close it here. Thank you.
A short question on delegalization. It's a while ago that I've read one of these cases. I think it was the OMT case. Wasn't the question there whether something was economic policy or monetary policy? Yeah. And I looked at it, of course, from the perspective of a complete outsider, and I wondered, since when is the distinction between monetary policy and economic policy really a legal distinction? And I began wondering, can I understand why the European Court of Justice says this is a sphere into which I cannot interfere because I lack the requisite normative standards. They're not there. So devaluation is something that happens as a reflection of the fact that the courts are asked to decide issues for which there is no law. Could this be a consequence? Is this a predicament?
No, this is destructional. But you see, why do we have the situation? I call it a diagonal conflict. You have monetary policy, Europeanized, economic policy, fiscal policy, national. They are interdependent, but they are governed at different levels. There is a conflict. how do you resolve the conflict? There is nothing in the treaty which helps you.
Right. Yeah.
And the court is right in saying monetary policy is not defined. So what we do is we give discretion to define it to the European Central Bank.
Yeah.
And this is the way out which keeps this together.
Unavoidably.
Well, it's emergency. It's
Yeah.
emergency
Yeah.
law. It's emergency law. It's unavoidable. Only I say it is also a destructive move because it is not by accident that nation states, member states have defended the budgetary power. The power of the purse is the core of a democracy. Who has the money? Who decide? Now the money is administered centrally by the European Central Bank, and this is not a permanent solution. But you're right that, of course, the treaty. But this is exactly the defectiveness of the design defect of the Maastricht Treaty on EMU, that you put this in place. You know it's a bad compromise. You know it cannot work, but you do it.
Yeah.
And this is bad politics, and not good for the law. Yeah.
Good. Augustin?
Yeah, only to add, because we don't disagree, so there is nothing to, we agree. So, but the question is very obviously, as you stress, that the consequence of this great transformation is the destruction of the law. We are undermining the law. But I think the interesting thing in OMT, and it's implicit in the new Advocate General position, it was explicit in proof, is this emergency rhetorics, on which he's quite explicit. He does not reason from that, but he makes reference at the beginning of the conclusions. This only can be understood if we take into account that we are in an undeclared emergency situation. But are we? Because if we were in an emergency situation, there would be the possibility of going back to normality. So emergencies are characterized by the fact that you are exceptionally moving out of normality and then we come back. And the problem is that it's very clear in the very reasoning of Kruth that this is not an emergency in this sense. It's simply that the law has broken down.
Yeah,
But they don't draw the conclusions from the fact that the law has broken down. You cannot go to the assumption that was central to the division of competencies in the Maastricht Treaty, that there is a clear division between economic and monetary policy. And without a clear division between economic and monetary policy, there is no way of limiting the power of the central bank. The whole edifice collapses if there is no. And this is now it's accepted. It's accepted explicitly by Kruth, and it's accepted by the dissenting opinions in the German Constitutional Court.
No, I have cited it.
They are saying that. But if the law has broken down, the question is that what is clear is that none of the courts should be the one deciding the issue, which is the dissenting opinion of Hertie.
Yeah.
That's the catch in which we are. And we don't have, at the same time, the procedures in order to produce the law that could substitute the vacuum. Because either the procedures are not there, so there is no emergency decision on the political side, or we have a blockage. We cannot agree to take the political decisions. So we have
I'm citing in my paper a guy, Ashokado, Modi, the Indian economist. And I think his book, it's called Euro Tragedy, is absolutely insightful. He has written an analysis of the reference of the German Constitutional Court to the European Court of Justice. And what he says is, I understand that these judges, like Augustin says, well, look, we have a treaty here and it says economic policy, monetary policy. We cannot simply operate as if it would not exist. We have somehow to respect it. But then he adds, since the decision is, or the, like Alexander Sasha says, this is a distinction which is in the mindset, I understand, for political reasons why it is there, because the member states wanted to defend their budgetary powers,
right.
and nevertheless they wanted to do it and did not know what they did. They did not know what they would the effects of their acting. Now, if this is so, I understand, Modi says, that the non-existing fiscal union is produced by the bank because it somehow has to happen. It has to happen. Now, it is an emergency, if you want an emergency in the sense that we have a legal framework which, if we stick to it, worsens things still. And then we all, as lawyers, say, well, there is a certain legitimacy to the law. Now, what I find so great about Judge Lübbe-Wolf in the decision is that she lists a couple of reasons why what we are doing now through judicial decision-making is beyond what courts should do. And among her reasons is a couple, and they are listed in my paper. But two of them, I think, are extremely interesting, where she says, everybody knows in Germany, the government is behind that, all parties behind that, with the exception of the AfD. And then it seems we do the opposite, it seems to be just right. Everybody wanted to defend the euro, and then a court comes along and says, hey, we have in the treaty this distinction, and we stick to that, and this is why the German Bundesbank must not participate in these kind of rescue operations. And at that point, what occurred was a kind of, well, transfer fiscal union through the central bank. But the problem is, which I see, and where she is again right, that courts should not do these kind of things. They should not legitimize it, because then they stop at the same time political debate. The politicians are absolutely happy with these courts. They don't have to do anything. Everything is integration through law persists, and we can be happy, and Draghi is a very clever person, and so on. But it is nevertheless a scandal. And, well, my hope at the end of the paper is, if they would have said, this cannot be done, we are not legitimate to do that, could at least come up with some ideas or some procedural requirements what should happen in the political sphere. The courts do this all the time, especially our constitutional court. In many instances says, okay, this is now a situation where we cannot simply strike down the law, but we can impose on you the duty to rethink, to do something new. This kind of opening of the political debate through law is something which I think would have been possible, and in the logic of Lübbe-Wolf's argument. So, final point where I feel also she was wonderful when she said, here is one court, she was talking to the German court, taking a decision which does not simply affect Germany, but affects the rest of Europe in the same way. The German court is not legitimate to do that. This is not to say that the court has to approve everything, but that the court has not the legitimacy to strike it down. Okay, I come back to this idea, what else could they do than to say the political process has to be reopened and give some directions. And okay, for the European Court, I think the situation is not so different.
Good. Thank you. Mike, and afterwards, Calypso.
Thanks, Christine. I agree with 95%, but I just want to pick
This
on
is
the
good.
5% that I disagree with.
Yeah.
Or at least I'm not sure if it's a corrective or a disagreement, but I'm not sure that the regime is quite so open as you suggest. I mean, I agree, of course, that the order liberal rules, that's not what has been going on. But if we think about the way the regime has been interpreted, it's price stability, it's fiscal discipline, it's the avoidance of moral hazard. That's how conditionality is read into the treaty. That's how Article 136 makes the no bailout regime compatible with a bailout. You can have your bailout, but you have to do X, Y, and Z. So the form, I agree, it's not order liberal, but the norms, I think we cannot escape from the underlying order liberal nature of the goal.
I may intervene with Polanyi.
Okay.
If you do that, I mean, okay, I agree also. I mean, what is fiscal discipline? But it is not in the order liberal books, not in Eucken and this kind of people. They have been very rigid in many respects, but what the present government has done is not the order. They have destroyed the markets. They have replaced market mechanisms by economic policy or by all sorts of political decisions. But and they have, of course, and this is right, you can say, didn't they still think we can save the system by imposing market discipline here and there?
It's
That's
the
your
liberal
point.
interventionism, exactly. It's the
Yeah.
intervening to
However,
ultimately
what did
safeguard-
Polanyi say? You will fail.
Yeah.
And he's right again.
I agree with you.
Polanyi is always right.
No, he says if you expose, say, a country like Italy with its own economic philosophies, his own economic traditions, his own economic culture, to a kind of foreign discipline. If you do that, you will be destructive. That's what he predicted. And not, you cannot, of course, predict this kind of situation, but the imposed convergence is something which is deeply anti-Polanyi. This is why I've cited this wonderful little passage where he said, let these nations organize their economies at will. And there is, I think, a political wisdom in that thing. Yeah.
Tristan?
So, I mean, two questions, but to follow on Augustine and Mike. At the end of the day, and Modi is not very, is ambiguous about this. The question becomes, is the problem the very existence of a common currency, or the way it's been managed in the way that you described, Christian? And I think Modi, I mean, I had discussions with him about this, and at first, but I may be wrong and I want to be corrected from around the room, but you know, at first he was trying to think through how this could be done differently.
Yeah.
And perhaps with the kind of political framing that you described, perhaps, although, you know, I mean, the central, I think it's too easy to go after Pringle and the ECB. The ECB just creates space for politics. I mean, in that kind of, that's how I understand Marxist politics, is at some point in time, you're the ECB, you create space. The problem is the politicians don't occupy the space, or if they do, they try to convert. So we come back to this fundamental question, you know, in a Polanyi's, you know, concern for diversity, especially of our welfare state, but above all of our fiscal traditions and all the rest of it. Is it even possible to have a monetary union? And we know how in the US, you know, the dollar meant that we have zero deficit for all states, okay.
We have a huge...
but can I ask my two questions? So one is that, it's really the structural problem that we come back to all the time. But the other is, in your paper and presentation, Christian, you go from the single market and what it does to the diversity of states and welfare state to monetary union. And I would suggest, I mean, I believe it is possible to have a single market under mutual recognition and trust, etc., that accommodates diversity. It's not necessarily what's happened, yes, but it did happen for quite a while, and it does happen in some sectors. As long, you know, even in finance, you have home country control. Okay, you always have the kind of trope towards common rules, etc. But does it have to be the case? Whereas on monetary use, I think the problems of relationship between economic policy and regulation and diversity are quite different between this, are very different between single market and monetary union. And part of what we want to think through is, you know, that difference. I know that you think a lot about this. I was wondering if you could comment on it.
No, I do think that it is surprising how some, at least, I know only a few economic historians, go into these matters and say, well, it is diversity is there anyway. You cannot eliminate it, so learn to live with it. This is, so to speak, the great message. And I do think that the Europeans, and this is the Polanyian cooperation model, right? That you have to tolerate what your neighbors does unless you are affected and so on. But the first question, the more important, we have monetary union, we have created it, and we are entrapped, as Hoffe says. There are nevertheless signals that there are alternatives conceivable. I don't know many, but I am in this little Piketty club I have looked into. Fritz Sharp has just published again one of his efforts to say we should have 2 euros in Europe, the North Europe euro and the South euro. How can you organize it? Okay, all very difficult, but imagine how many people we have to defend the misconstructed European Union. How many people are there to consider, well, what are alternative ways of organizing the economy? And I do believe, I cannot imagine that there is no alternative. I'm not Merkel, I mean. And she, I mean, this is so absurd to say it is monetary union, hence we are living under the constraints that the functional necessities of monetary union impose upon us, and this cannot be undone. It can be modified. At least there are some proposals on the table, and there will be more.
Yeah, I mean, in the end of the Eurocrats dream with Max Watson, an economist, sociologist, we try to talk about a very decentralized MU and what it would mean, and letting the markets do their magic, but at the same time having backstops. I mean, there are ways of thinking about this, and not just 2 euros, which I don't see.
Well, okay, that's just for monetary union.
Yeah.
The problem is, and this is why I find it great that you know Modi, but his book is, I think, so insightful because he tells us how at each step there was a political decision being taken. It was not simply the functional necessity of the economy, it was always also political. I don't think he is Polanyian, but he has the insight of a great practitioner who is respected by his colleagues and nevertheless knows what we do is not just execute economic models.